for whatever reason, we have a KGB declassified document talking about Earth's history, not just in the past like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. For whatever reason, this document goes into world history back hundreds of thousands of years. So this document contains all kinds of weird stuff in the timeline. First of all, the fact that it goes back hundreds of thousands of years in and of itself is already crazy. Because why? I mean, what the real first question that we have to ask is, why does a document released by the KGB give a crap about 100,000 plus 500 plus thousand years ago worth of history? And even more interesting is that these 100,000 plus years ago histories that this document covers, for whatever reason, it really gets into the whole Sumerian creation myth. It actually tries to build and present a chronology of that entire Sumerian creation myth. I mean, like, why? Why does this document exist? Why would anybody in the KGB go out of their way to create this? Like, that's the first thing that blows my mind. When you start reading this thing, at first you're like, all right, let me check this out. And you're instantly slapped with like just straight archaeology schizo stuff. It's hilarious. And okay, and I'll be honest, maybe that's, all right, fine. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the document was created, was for schizos, so that it could make schizos look crazy, and they could inject like a really weird timeline into the Sumerian alien schizo thing. For those of you not aware of what the hell I'm talking about, if you go look up really quick something called the Enuma Elish, you will come into a cuneiform Akkadian transcript thing that is the creation of humanity and creation of Earth, etc., etc. It's basically the creation story of the Sumerians and Mesopotamia. And it's quite a read, right? This is where a lot of the ancient alien stuff comes from. It's based off of what they found on all of those cuneiform tablets and what they were able to transcribe as the Enuma Elish. Now, the Enuma Elish, by the way, is not like its official title. That's just like the first couple of words, I believe, in the document. And so that's what they called it. When they found these, well, not documents, remember, these are clay tablets. So they're not papers or books. We were not, we didn't find a Bible or something. But the story found in the Enuma Elish really goes crazy. I mean, the way that it's read, if you read the like official translation of the Enuma Elish, it's kind of weird, but what it talks about is it can kind of be interpreted as basically aliens coming down and creating humans. Now, that's a very, very brief schizo overview of it, and it's not quite that simple. But that's where a lot of the ancient alien stuff comes from, right? Because people will point to these tablets and they'll be like, well, I mean, our ancient ancestors were talking about it. Why would they talk about things that are obviously maybe sort of futuristic if back in the day they were just, eating mud and, scratching their ass with grass or something, right? So it gives credence to what the people may have been talking about back then. But that's only because we don't give credit, or not we, I'm not going to say we. Mainstream academia doesn't give credit to the people back in the day for even having like basic self-awareness skills or critical thinking capabilities. Remember, the people back then were just as capable of like us now, right? There's no real difference according to mainstream anthropology. So there's no real reason to believe that, the ancient Mesopotamians or anybody back in that day would not be able to comprehend, say, a spaceship or something like that, right? Now, that's all for a different show anyways. The main point that I wanted to talk about is the fact that we find the story of the Enuma Elish being taken seriously here in a KGB document. It's weird that this document actually goes into some sort of depth regarding Enki and Enlil. Now, Enki is, Enki is kind of supposed to be the god of water. Enki can also be called Ea if, you know, those two are kind of interchangeable, which of course leads us to one of the problems that we face when we start looking at the Sumerian creation mythologies, is that there's consistency, but then there's like not consistency. There's contradicting stories when you start to get into reading all of the tablets and you start to look, well, especially when you start to look at the different translations. There's a whole jumbled up mess there. So this KGB document appears to go out of its way to try to make a chronology out of the old Sumerian creation tale. Why? Like, why even bother with something like that? Why? And they go and this is not a small document. They don't just like start going into it for like a paragraph and then say these people are crazy and then move on. It's the opposite. They go into pages and pages about the chronology of what the Sumerians recorded happened with regard to how humans were created, how the earth went through the transformations that it has gone through over the millennia, or in the case of this document, I mean, they're willing to give credit to hundreds of thousands of years ago, a lot of the events of the Enuma Elish happening. Now, this is where we run into our first problem, and that problem is one of chronology. Now, this document actually goes through and tries to lay out one hell of a deep chronology relative to the Enuma Elish. But what it does, for some weird reason, is that it decides to start the chronology 450,000 years ago BC. Now this number, I don't know why. This number comes from, the document sort of explains that this is what like the Nazi researchers found, and other researchers have come to these conclusions, etc. But I'd have to see the sources for that, because the first problem that we run into when we start to deal with chronology is the fact that if we look at the reality of how many years have probably truly passed since life has existed on this earth, and I mean truly, not in the way the mainstream looks at it, I mean scientifically. Like, we actually look at the scientific reality of life on this planet. Life on this planet generally does not seem to have been here that long. Now that's kind of a different show as well, but that's the reality that we see. The geology does not support it, and I know right now you're probably screaming at this saying, oh yeah, but I mean, isn't the Cretaceous 8 billion years ago, and isn't Jurassic 12 million trillion years ago? Didn't the scientists already figure this out? No, absolutely not. These people have no dating method at all that is reliable when it comes to dating anything in the past like that. To make the claim that you know something happened 20 million years ago, or 400 million years ago, or 1 billion years ago, like mainstream science does, that's insane. It's ludicrous. We have zero evidence that proves any of that. I mean, just nothing. This is a scientific fact. This is what people, they don't want to hear that. Like, nobody wants to hear that, because the reality is, where we are now as a society, at least in the Western world, is that we have all been psychologically conditioned to believe that we have it all basically figured out. And that's where Western society stands, right? We have the Big Bang. We know for a fact that the Big Bang is what created the universe, 13 billion years ago, and that's, this physicist guy, believes it, and Einstein believes it, so it must be real. We're just looking for the evidence. And then you ask, oh, you haven't found the evidence yet? And they're like, no, not really. I mean, you can kind of look at some of this evidence and interpret it for the Big Bang, but it's got to be real. I mean, it has to be real, because people up in, academia say it's real, so it must be real. They wouldn't lie, would they? Okay, so it's ridiculous. Right now, the funny part about the Big Bang, actually, is that the James Webb Telescope has scientifically destroyed that entire stupid theory. The James Webb Telescope right now, as you live and breathe, has already put to rest the entire concept of the Big Bang. It's gone. It's done. It was done before it even started, but now we have the real science that actually proves it. And it's funny to watch all the cosmologists either completely ignore this fact, or they're just scrambling to try to figure out a different way to shove in the James Webb Telescope evidence to fit the Big Bang. That's not how science is done. That is not how we do science. We do not force the evidence into our conclusion. We do it the opposite. We follow the evidence to the conclusion. Right? It's that simple. If you're not doing that, you're not doing science, right? And so anyway, cosmologists, they're not doing real science. The James Webb Telescope has gotten rid of that. Anyway, okay, my main point is that we as a society believe that we have all of this basically figured out, right? So we can say, well, we know where existence came from. It's the Big Bang. And so over time, what has happened is everybody has become comfortable to some degree or another believing that they have a firm grasp on reality, even to the point to where you know where it came from. Now, religious people, don't start chuckling and laughing. You're in the exact same boat. Religious people suffer the exact same problem, ironically, that the mainstream cosmologists and scientists have, right? I mean, I'm not attacking anybody. The religious person, they find solace in the fact that they know for a fact that God created everything. So what that does psychologically for a human is that gives you a certain level of subconscious comfort and absolutely conscious comfort, right? You will find comfort in these answers and you'll move on with life. Now that might not seem like it's all that big of a deal, but it's funny. If you can feel confident knowing the true beginning, then you feel confident that you have a good control over your reality. Now, the reality of that is that we do not have that kind of control. We don't know where all of this came from. We do not have reliable dating methods to put really hardcore dates on something that may have happened 400,000 years ago. Like we just don't have it. That's a reality that we have to face. I only bring all this crap up just to make a point that I could have made in like 2 seconds, but I wanted to explain it. And that point is this: whenever we see some sort of an establishment talking about something that happened 450,000 years ago, like we do here in this KGB book or document or whatever, we have to remember that these dates are not backed up by any science that at the very least is known in the mainstream as being foolproof. We just don't have that kind of a dating method. So this document, it starts 450,000 years BC for some weird reason. And then it goes from there. So this document starts to go through the timeline, and it uses a chronological timeline that deals with, hundreds of thousands of years. And this is in relation to the Sumerian myth. Now, like I said, I'm not in where the true sources are for where they came up with these numbers. It's not presented in the document. They do not come out and show you all the experiments that, like, for example, the Anunnaki were doing in Nazi Germany. They're not coming out and showing you all the other occult organizations' experiments or evidence. They don't do that, which it's not. I'm not blaming the document. They probably couldn't fit it all in there if they wanted to. But it does beg the question, when we do go through this document, we have to ask, is the evidence that they are using to come to these chronological conclusions, is it, accurate? Is it reliable? Is this truly something that those groups in the past truly had a grasp on? And in all honesty, I'm going to have to say no, because for right now, from a scientific perspective, I don't have that evidence, and they don't show it in this document. I only bring all this up because I want everybody to be aware that when you start to hear dates like 100,000 years ago, you have to be really skeptical. It's time for you to really look at that claim and ask serious questions. Now, a lot of you probably are going to do that if you even care, which is great. But the problem is even more people out there don't. And the reason why they don't, especially when it comes to something like the Sumerian creation myth, is because those people probably have fallen prey to or have decided to latch on to the ancient alien possibility with respect to the Sumerian chronology. The Sumerian chronology offers I guess we could call it a chronology, but that story offers the same thing to, people in the alternative research area that it gives to your religious person or your mainstream believer, and that is comfort. Right? So if you don't believe in the mainstream and you don't believe in religious stuff, then where does that put you? Well, a lot of people get lost. So a lot of people on the alternative research side, unfortunately, will latch on to something that is very easy for them to latch on to comfort-wise. Right? Psychologically, people are not looking to be in a realm of chaos. Humans are not happy when they don't know stuff. Generally speaking, I mean, we can't know everything, but when a human faces existential unknowns, like, where do you come from? That's a pretty good question. That's a pretty, it's something that you would probably want to have a grasp on. And the reality is that the Enuma Elish, it gives an opportunity to those people who feel lost. It gives them something to latch onto. And they do. And once that happens, it snowballs. It's the exact same thing that religious people have, and mainstream people have as well. Once you start to buy into the garbage, it just snowballs and you'll just get stuck in there. And before you know it, you're willing to believe even the most blatant of lies, right? Or unsubstantiated apparent truths. So for example, the Big Bang, right? We still have cosmologists believing in the Big Bang, even though their own devices are now proving to them that the Big Bang never happened. Not only didn't happen, there's no reason to suppose it happened. You might as well just pick any random theory you want. But those people are going to hold on to the Big Bang until they die because that's comforting to them. And we run into the same situation in alternative historical research because people are trying to figure out where we came from. The Sumerian story is a really good one, and people can latch on to that because of the way that it is described. So this KGB document does that. This KGB document uses the Sumerian chronology to prove where humans come. Well, I'm not saying that they believe it, like they believe this. I guess they're just outlining the general, ideology that all of these occult groups have come to the conclusion of. Right, so they try to put all of this together. But the first problem that we are going to run into is the actual dating that they put these events in. So, like I said, I know I've been talking for 10,000 hours. Let's get to it. This starts 450,000 years BC. What? That number is insane. They may as well just come up with whatever they want. But anyways, okay, let's get into this actually. One of the reasons why people probably came to the conclusions of hundreds of thousands of years ago the Anunnaki show up is because this document, well, let's go into this document, not everybody. This document focuses on catastrophism. One of the things that people have, one of the problems that people generally have with catastrophism is people don't want to believe that huge Earth-wide catastrophic events may have taken place just a few thousand years ago. And by, Earth-wide catastrophic events, I'm literally talking about parts of continents sinking, other parts of land rising out of the ocean. I mean, something that literally changes the face of planet Earth. People, we've all been, not all, if you are Westernly trained, we've all been trained to think that, a continent moving, yeah, it can move, but it takes 10 billion years, right? So when somebody says, nah, dude, that continent sank overnight, your average person immediately has psychological barriers that spring up and block any further thought with respect to what that person might be presenting when you're talking about a sinking continent. There's nothing unscientific, by the way, of a sinking continent or land raising out of the ocean or anything like that. Those are all 100% scientific possibilities. There's nothing weird with it. So what this document is doing when it starts to throw things back 100,000, 200,000, 450,000 years ago, what this document does is that it It commits the crime that mainstream geologists commit, or mainstream anybody in the mainstream. Mainstream anybody in the, like that. Anybody in the mainstream, they always commit this crime of pushing everything back hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of years in the past, because then they don't have to prove anything. Right? So you'll see lectures out there on YouTube, for example, where you'll have some guy saying, "Let me explain to you what happened 2 billion years ago on the planet. Here is the entire story of the Earth. We have it all mapped out." Right? And your average person who runs into that and watches it is going to nod their head and agree, and they're not going to question any of it, because why would that person lie? Why would that person with a Harvard degree lie to me? Surely some of his friends would call him out, or other people from other universities would absolutely call that out. It can't possibly, he's right. Anything else other than what that dude says has to be wrong. And that's ridiculous. Like, how arrogant do you have to be to claim that you know what happened 2 billion years ago up until now? How make it, it's the most stupid crap you can imagine, right? But that's what they do. Anyway, but when you do that, when you throw something back 1 billion years and you make a claim, right? Scientifically, I should be able to come up to you then and be like, "Okay, well, now I need you to prove it. You need to reproduce it with experimentation and observation. We need that data to substantiate your 2 billion year ago claim." And then the other person could say, "Well, it happened 2 billion years ago. I can't do anything with that. It's too far long gone ago. It's 2 billion years. Just trust me, bro." That's literally what the mainstream is. Trust me, bro. That might as well just be the entire catchphrase for all mainstream science. Trust me, bro. That's it. Because if you don't trust them, you're a conspiracy theorist immediately. Right? So you have to trust that these people know exactly what happened 2 billion years ago. Ridiculous. We have no clue what happened 2 billion years ago. We have no clue what happened 450,000 years ago. And we have no reason to even believe that the Earth existed in any shape, form, or another 450,000 years ago. We have no reason to believe this. That ancient belief of the Earth being 4 billion or whatever they have it now, that is literally just an ass pull. They just pulled that number out of thin air, and then they used whatever circumstantial evidence they can find to support it, and that's it. That's law. Now, before the atheists shut this down and start thinking that I'm going to start preaching God, don't forget, I do not believe in God, and no, I do not believe in some sort of weird young earth creation garbage. I don't believe in any of that. What my point is that my main point is to say that we don't know how old the earth is. We do not understand. Well, maybe we do understand how the Earth is formed now with respect to plasma physics and all of that stuff. We actually may know that. But the year that this happened, we have no clue. Like, we have no idea when the Earth truly formed. Right? We don't have it. And that's it. And that's okay. It's okay to say, "I don't know." Isn't that so easy? It's so freeing. Just say it. You say, "I don't know," and then you can move on with life. You don't have to know everything. All right, okay, let's get to the document. All right, so we are going to read the part where they talk about the Enki and Lil situation, the Anunnaki, basically. But this, interestingly enough, this is kind of like the halfway point in the story for this document. When they start talking about the Anunnaki, they talk about the Anunnaki coming from the Iron Planet. That is what this document supposes is essentially coming into our solar system every 10, 12,000 years or so, and that this Iron Planet is responsible for all of the catastrophe, or most of the catastrophes that Earth runs into. This document actually talks about other people from other planets as well, apparently. But we're just going to focus on the Anunnaki section here, because I've just been reading up a lot about this stuff, and so we are going to read this first. Then we will go back further and cover the rest of this document, if I'm bored enough. Okay, so let's read. The document here for the Anunnaki starts 450,000 years BCE. The gods, quote unquote, from the quote unquote Iron Planet arrived on Earth. After the death of Atlantis and the gods from Venus, as it follows from the texts of the Anunnaki almanacs, German scientists had at their disposal the original of the legendary manuscript of the List of Kings, compiled by the Egyptian philosopher and historian of antiquity Manetho, on the instructions of the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy of Philadelphia in 270 AD. Now, once again, the chronology here. Anyway, let's keep reading. There were 4 copies of this manuscript in total. 2 of them were destroyed in 642 AD by Muslims in the Library of Alexandria. Now, yeah, I know I'm stopping already. So here's our first problem, and it's not really necessarily the document's fault, but they're talking about the Library of Alexandria as if it is confirmed real. A lot of people don't know that we have zero evidence, zero archaeological evidence of anything called the Library of Alexandria. Even worse, I know maybe some of you out there are like, nuh-uh, archaeologists think they found it over here. Yes, but I can show you 5 other dig sites where other archaeologists think that they found it elsewhere. That's a problem. I only bring this up because documents from basically any document that we have our hands on nowadays, we have to be extremely careful with whenever we read into this material and try to believe in any of the dates that we are presented with. There's 2 reasons for this. One reason, and I've covered this on this channel extensively, go look at like the Dark Ages and stuff like that. But anyways, one of the problems that we have as historical researchers is that, you know, whenever we try to find ancient texts to use as, you know, any kind of a guide or proof or anything of stuff that happened in antiquity, we run into the problem of not really having any of the originals from thousands of years ago. A lot of people do not realize that we, at least in the general public, I don't know about private collectors and, you know, the dark side of things, but the general public, we do not have access, nor is there such a thing as, you know, an entire library from 2,000 years ago that has been preserved. We don't have any of this stuff. Right, the Sumerian clay tablets that we do have, we only have those because they were clay, and they miraculously survived throughout the past couple thousand years. So we got lucky there. But if any work was put down on any kind of parchment, that stuff is basically gone. And it's not gone just because of bad actors, you know, burning it, destroying it, you know, hiding it, whatever. That stuff just degrades. Nothing lasts forever. We have to, you know, we have to deal with the second law of thermodynamics every day in our lives when it comes to historical research, and it's a very real problem. The other problem we have, not just, you know, the general, you know, decay of information, but the other huge problem that we run into is that in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, basically the Renaissance time, we run into a period of time to where monks, churches, frauds, etc., people start to copy down the old manuscripts, and as they're copying them, they make changes. Not so first of all, even if the thing you're reading is a copy of what should have been an original manuscript, there's a really good chance that A, it was copied wrong in the first place, right? Something could have been omitted, something could have been mistranslated, you know, just basic human error. But even worse is the fact that we know for a fact that, you know, the monks, for example, who were trying to set up history, they literally were changing dates, adding in events, removing other events, and making up dates so that history made sense, right? And that's just the reality. So when we start looking at dates, or we hear about sources of information that we all rely on, like something, say, from the Library of Alexandria, it's funny to find out that we have no proof that any of that exists. And even worse, we know for a fact that some of the information that we may be using as fact may actually be either twisted or completely made up. So this document so it's funny, while this document goes into alternative research topics, it still very much adheres to a very mainstream outlook on how history is approached. So it gets weird, and in fact, because it takes that approach, it actually jumbles things up even more. And for those of you out there who like psychological warfare, that's probably exactly what the intention of this document was to do. Because like we've already read, we're now dealing with 450,000 years ago, right? So A, the document doesn't need to provide you really with any proof. And B, if you have psychological conditioning programs out there that are further pushing these kinds of dates in various circles, right, this just serves to bolster that psychological falsity. Anyway, so it's, you know, psychological warfare. What do you want from me? It's not directed at the masses, right? Because most people are going to look at this and throw it away. They're going to laugh at it and, no, that's ridiculous and stupid, and they move on. But there will be people who are, you know, more attuned to this kind of information, and they might read this and be like, oh yeah, hey, if the KGB says it's real, then, you know, that must be real because the American government lies to me, but the KGB, they wouldn't lie to me, right? And so, you know, you kind of, anyway, you got to be careful with this stuff. Let's keep going. The remaining copies were kept in the secret library of the Vatican and in Tibet. In 1938, one copy of the manuscript of Manetho was given to Ernst Schaeffer in Tibet in Lhasa at the Patola Palace by the dying Dalai Lama XIII. Okay, the next paragraph starts out with the word screw. I'm not sure why. Remember, this is kind of oddly translated from Russian, so I don't know why it says screw. Anyway, screw as follows from the text of the List of Kings. 450,000 years BC from the Iron Planet, planet of hundreds of millions of years, the god Amon arrived with his sons Anu and Enki, who founded the Eritic kingdom in the Syrian desert in order to extract gold necessary for the dying atmosphere of their dying planet. Now, for those of you even on the alternative side that don't really know much about this, you probably heard at some point in time somebody talking about, you know, an alien race comes down to Earth. They need to extract gold to save, you know, to put into the atmosphere from their dying world, right? And that's, man, the alternative researchers really latch on to this because it sounds really scientific. It's not implausible, I suppose. And, of course, to make matters worse in this particular arena of study is we have somebody like Zecharia Sitchin that exists. And, of course, he made popular this whole concept of the Anunnaki coming down, you know, to our planet, creating humans as slaves to mine gold for, you know, their planet so that they could put it all in the atmosphere and that it would repulse the sun's rays and everybody would be happy and hugging and slapping each other on the butt. You know, that's the Zecharia Sitchin perspective. And I'll be honest, you know, I wonder if this document is at all inspired by any of Sitchin's translations. I'll have to dig into that. I don't know for sure. It might be in there somewhere. I might have missed it. But this is a very Sitchin thing here, and I gotta be honest, I am not a huge fan of Zecharia Sitchin. The reason why is because if you watch interviews with this guy, he will discard other scientific information that goes against his particular theory. Not always, but he does it enough to where it really, man, it sucks. It starts to really call into question a lot of the stuff that he does. We should be questioning it anyway, but you know, so for those of you who are dead on Zecharia Sitchin believers, I would say back off a little bit, really question some of the stuff that he proposes. I know this isn't about Zecharia Sitchin, but Sitchin is a huge part of nowadays understanding of the Sumerian language, or at least the stories. I'm not going to say the language, but, you know, the stories. And a lot of people have latched on to this stuff. And I get why. It is very intriguing initially. But as we start to learn more about real history and real science, I'm not saying all of Sitchin's stuff is garbage. He might actually have some good stuff in there that we can use. But you have to be careful with Sitchin. Anyway, so this kind of goes in a bit of a Sitchin route. but I don't know if Sitchin inspired this document or not. Okay, nobody cares what I have to say on this. Anyway, let's keep moving. The Enki, and that's what this document calls them, the Enki, not the Anunnaki. I'm not sure why. The Enki subsequently founded on Earth the civilization of the invaders, Anunnaki, or Petri Anunnaki, who enslaved humanity and created colonies of people in the Syrian desert. According to German scientists, the occupiers conducted biological experiments on people in the mountains Shurapaki, the Shurapak Mountains. Just remember, this translation's weird, so it's not just me being stupid. It's the way it's written. To conduct experiments, their divine sister Nurnherzog, who founded the hospital in Shurapak, arrived on Earth in an quote-unquote airboat. In the period up to 199,586 BC, the gods of the Iron Planet created dozens of cities and settlements of colonists. The cities were built in the orbit of the circle so that they formed a navigation scheme in the complex, which was clearly visible from space. Not quite sure what they mean. That's maybe weirdly translated. Several industrial centers were created on Earth to process gold, which the gods delivered in the form of transmuted powder to their planet. I wonder if that's the monoatomic gold or not. I don't know. The gods and their warriors took this powder for food. Yeah, it's got to be monoatomic, thus prolonging their life on Earth. Yeah, monoatomic gold. For those of you who don't know what monoatomic gold is, there's a way of processing gold apparently to where it becomes this white powder substance. And like this thing just said, if you consume it, it's supposed to, make you live forever, basically. I don't know. Don't look at, maybe it's true. I don't know. Maybe go find some and try it. I don't know. Tell me what happens. All right, where are we at? The powder was allowed to be eaten by people who served the gods to get rid of serious and incurable diseases. As follows from the texts, people took part in the war between the gods 380,000 years BC, but the texts of the almanacs do not specify this in detail. I actually want to know where the hell they get this 380,000 year date at all. It's the King's List. That's okay. See, you know what? King's Lists. There's an Egyptian's King List. Okay, so these King's Lists that exist out there. This is kind of an aside thing, but it holds true for this. A lot of our chronology is based on Egyptian King Lists. And Egyptian King Lists have been calibrated by people that, they literally just averaged out what they thought were the right dates. And those averages of guesses basically eventually became law. So these King's Lists, the problem with King's Lists in general, and the Sumerian ones have the exact same problems that the Egyptian ones have, is that you find yourself with duplicates and triplicates, right? So you'll find two to three of the same name in these lists, and they are counted as separate people, right? When the reality is they probably were not separate people. The next thing, and the most damning thing of this whole problem, is the fact that the way the dates are calculated. So we literally find ourselves with rulers lasting like 50,000 years, right? This is a problem in the Bible as well. And this is a whole other dating subject that I'm not going to get into right now. I just wanted to point out to be aware that whenever you hear people talking and using a King's List to support a particular date or a chronology of something, be really careful with that. And in fact, probably don't even take it seriously. If you're interested in it, go do your own research and really look into it, and dig into that King's List and use a critical thinking eye. And even people who aren't trained at all in this, if you just critically think about, if you critically approach the King's Lists, you can find all the problems, and you can see that you need to discard stuff. Let's keep it at that. Anyway, so, okay. As follows from the texts, people took part in that war. All right, so let's keep going. We're in 199,586 years BC. Also, I don't know what this war is. So they're talking about some sort of a war. I don't know what they're talking about. And how do you even date that anyway? Anyway. Around the asteroid ring passes the Iron Planet. On the Earth, facing it from the Pacific Ocean, due to the force of reverse gravity and anti-gravity, Armageddon occurs, as a result of which water is displaced to the continents. Now we're going to get into some of the fun part. Before we go further, like they're talking about gravity and anti-gravity and stuff like that. This document is weird. It's one of the reasons why I found this document interesting is because it does talk about plasma physics principles having an effect on our planet and the solar system in general, which is real science, which is exactly what we really should be doing. But they also still use some relativity garbage as well. Not that gravity doesn't exist. Gravity exists, but it's just an effect of electricity, right? So I wish they would. Anyway, let's keep going. Now we're starting to get into the fun stuff. The electromagnetic and geographical poles of the Earth are shifting. The first ice age is coming. Now, I have a problem with ice ages as well. And the problem that I have with ice ages is that ice ages never happened. We have, that, you know, okay, that just, all right, I'm not, here, okay, so people use ice ages as one of these catch-all events to explain a bunch of anomalous evidence that we find in the geological and biological record, right? It takes 2 seconds to disprove that ice ages ever existed, but this document, that's what's weird about this document. See, it incorporates both like real new science that the mainstream does not acknowledge, but then it absolutely still uses mainstream concepts like the Ice Age. They mix it in there with their stories. So the story gets just absolutely discombobulated, which is probably exactly what this document wants to do. So we're going to do multiple shows on the Ice Ages, but for our purposes, just remember that the Ice Ages, those didn't happen. The entire concept is stupid. If you don't believe me, go read up on the guy who created the Ice Age, and go read up on the people's reaction to the guy creating the Ice Age. The people who actually, back in the day, by the way, back in the way when the Ice Ages were first proposed, that dude was laughed off the face of the planet because the concept is stupid and the evidence does not conform to that. It literally took an entire like publicized, you know, effort from the mainstream to push that into the mainstream science and to make it sound like fact. And it took several generations, by the way, as well. It could be, like I said, everybody who was around when the Ice Age was proposed, they were 100% against it because it was stupid. And it is. It's scientifically stupid. But, you know, hey, once those people die off and you're able to continue a lie en masse, you know, all over the planet, if you can keep pushing your lie, well, then you can convince anybody of anything, regardless of how smart they are, right? So anyway, that's what happened with the Ice Age. Okay, let's keep moving. Okay. The gods who knew about the onset of the flood saved a part of humanity, which they chose in the number of 14,400 people to populate the earth with them after warming. See, the chronology gets weirder. Anyway, let's keep going. It says Anna there for some weird reason. 100,000 years BC, Enki and their soldiers, warriors, marry earthly women and develop a race of demigods on Earth to control people. You know, it's interesting. So that's probably in reference to the Anunnaki. Let's keep going really quick and let's see. The same events are described in Genesis. Here we go. Chapter 6:2. When people began to multiply on earth, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took them for themselves as wives, whichever one chose. All right, so yeah, this is where we start getting into the Nephilim and all of that stuff. But here's my problem with the document. So they're talking about 100,000 years ago. Now, the Bible, you know, obviously the Bible, well, the Bible doesn't give us a real date now, does it? But here we find ourselves dealing with the story of the Nephilim and all of that stuff. Now, the Nephilim, that's a whole insane story, and oddly enough, actually very believable in maybe what may have happened in our past. So this KGB document has got this particular event apparently set at 100,000 years BC. Once again, we don't need that many years for all of this stuff to have happened. And I don't think that you know, it's funny, I don't think the Sumerian texts themselves make the claim that any of these events would have happened at this kind of a chronological period. Anyway, okay, well, anyway, let's keep going. I'm just gonna piss myself off. All right. Before the second Armageddon, the gods also left a part of the chosen humanity in the amount of 14,400 people in order to continue the human race after the second flood, which occurred 84,386,000 years BC for the same reasons as the first flood. So, okay, this is interesting. One of the things that we read when we go back into the Sumerian texts is, okay, so everybody understands that there was a deluge, and the general idea was that the deluge happened because humans were just too full of sin. Everybody was having sex with everybody, doing blow all day, and just prostitution and crime, and everything sucked, right? So God sends the flood down to wipe everybody out, right? Or if you're on the Sumerian side, you know, Enlil sends the flood down to wipe everybody out because he's sick of humans, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's interesting here that we have two floods being mentioned. So the reason why this is interesting is because, A, the Bible, most people only really think about one flood, and that's the deluge. And that appears to have definitely happened in our recent past. Okay. The second flood, though, or a second flood, isn't the same kind of flood as the first. And in all honesty, I wouldn't be surprised if this KGB document is interpreting the evidence of two floods or even three floods incorrectly. The reason why is because, once again, we always run into duplicates and triplicates when we start reading all these stories. The thing with the Sumerian tablets or the Akkadian tablets and the cuneiform and all of that stuff is it's not like we found this like perfectly preserved, you know, everything was in its place where it was, everything was in order, 100% perfect, and we could read from beginning to end and we knew the whole story. That's not how those tablets operated, right? You know, a lot of them are broken and shattered, which means that when they glue them back together, they're missing stuff. So for example, the Enuma Elish or Gilgamesh, the reason why we have at least a general good grasp on those two works is because we discovered multiple copies of them. Right, so I think we only found like one full copy of I don't think we have a full copy. But it gets even, you know, it gets even worse when you start to look at that kind of historical evidence. So not only are you dealing with, you know, just regular decay, then you have to deal with stuff that's broken, and then you have to put it together, and then of course you're just missing things. Even worse is that you have multiple versions of the same story being discovered. It would be like, you know, it's like today, right? Everything is being remade today, right? The powers that be are completely rewriting history, Western history right now with what's going on in Hollywood. So, you know, there's a lot of remakes. Well, video games, I guess, as well. Pretty much, you know, it's funny. Nobody is remaking books. Isn't that fascinating? It's because the vast majority of people don't read books anymore. Anyway, but in Hollywood and everything right now, we can have 2, 3, 4 different versions of the same story, right? Or even more than that. Which one's the original? Right? If you're an archaeologist looking back at today's time period and you're missing all kinds of evidence, and you find 4 different versions of the same movie, you know, which one is the real version, right? You could say, well, I mean, you should be able to tell which one is the newer one. You're assuming that, first of all, and there's no reason to believe that the first version is the technical real version. How do you like that? Right? The last version could technically be the real version. You know, we don't know. And that's the problem when we start to go back into these cuneiform tablets. is that we have multiple versions. And what do we get with multiple versions? Well, we get multiple different kinds of takes, right? So for example, you know, Enki is talked about in a lot of tablets, but then Enki becomes Ea in others, right? They still, those two characters still perform the same thing, but the names are different. And then we find contradictions, etc., etc. So I would not be surprised if the reason why this document is trying to point out multiple deluge-style floods happened, and they are misconstruing multiple versions of the same event as separate versions and separate events. Right? I'm not saying that that's true either, by the way. I don't have proof for that. My point is that we have to be careful of this stuff. When we start to see like identical events kind of lining up, that's a big red flag. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to point this out, because as you're doing your research, don't just nod your head in agreement with whatever the texts are talking about. Approach it critically. Like it's a legitimate question. Like, for example, in this particular part of this, whatever we're reading, to ask, are we sure that there are two different floods, or is this the same flood being misconstrued as two separate floods? That's a real question, and I'd be willing to bet that that's the case. The other problem, and well, okay, but then you can also say, yeah, but everybody even talks about multiple floods, and I agree, there were multiple floods, but every one of the floods that truly happened, they were under different circumstances and they affected the earth differently. So for example, the deluge, that's a very particular kind of flood. That flood would be rain, right? Nobody makes the claim of any other kind of the flood comes from the sky and from the ground. And the water just kind of rises, right? Nobody talks about anything other events. They blame it on the water breaking up from the ground, which is fascinating. And they talk about it raining from the sky, and that's it. Nobody is talking about a god flying by, dragging a mountain of water along with them, flooding the land like that. Different kind of flood. Anyway, so the document goes on. 77,000 years BCE, giant volcanic eruptions occur on Earth, and as a result, the second ice age begins. Life on Earth freezes over the next 500 years. Now I'm going to stop reading here, but let's cover some stuff really quick before I go kill myself. So one of the things that we have to understand here is that the Ice Age never happened, but notice how they keep blaming things on the Ice Age. Oh, another Ice Age begins. How do you know? What are you talking about? Who the hell says that another Ice Age begins? We don't have anything like this. And in fact, okay, you know what? Because none of the Sumerian myths, for example, talk about Ice Ages. In fact, if you go back, I would actually challenge somebody to show me this. Go back and read all the more ancient texts you can find and try to find the best translations you can get. See if you can find any ancient culture talking about, oh man, we got flooded and then a volcano erupted and then suddenly Ice Ages. Right? Nobody talks about Ice Ages. They don't exist. There's just nothing there. But everybody keeps blaming that crap on. Okay. Anyway. So this section ends by talking about tons of volcanic eruptions happening all over Earth, and which apparently triggers a random ice age. What it doesn't say is why you would find tons of volcanoes erupting all over Earth that would create this situation, and I don't have an answer for that because we don't have any reason to believe that tons of volcanoes on the Earth would just randomly start erupting without some sort of cause. So I know there's parts in this document where they try to blame the Earth's core from doing something nuclear or whatever. This doesn't even do that. So I don't know what's causing all of these volcanoes to suddenly erupt. But apparently they do, and then Earth freezes over for 500 years. And somehow life still exists just fine, even though the Earth is frozen over. Don't ask me how that happens. See, that's how dumb the Ice Ages are. We're gonna, the next show could probably be an Ice Age. Anyway, it's interesting that this document also, oh, you know what? Okay, let's cover this other problem with possible duplicates. So earlier in this page, or in this section, they talk about choosing 14,400 people to populate the Earth with them after they warm up the planet. Okay, so you have that number. And then more time passes, and then apparently there's a war. And then for whatever reason, they once again choose 14,400 people to repopulate the Earth again after another flood. You see what I'm saying? Like, we find duplicates in the story. It really begs the question, do we really need both of these events happening? Like, why would we find essentially the exact same event taking place back to back? Because that's what this document right here is claiming. So that's kind of a problem. That's a pretty big red flag. That is probably the perfect example of a duplicate being treated as two separate events. That's the kind of stuff that we have to watch out for. The other thing that's sort of interesting with the way that this document portrays the whole Enki and Lil Ea stuff going on is that this KGB document does not talk about it as if it is the beginning of the story. So if you read the Enuma Elish or get into any of that cuneiform stuff, those stories are very much told from the perspective of, hey, this is how this stuff begins, right? This is how humans begin. This is the beginning of the story, is when, you know, Enki and Lil and all of them, they come to Earth and they start doing their experiments and blah, blah, blah. That's the beginning. What's weird, this document actually doesn't start there. I know we're covering, you know, the Enki part of things, or the Anunnaki, but this is like a middle part of the story. Like I said, the Enuma Elish very much is the beginning of everything as far as that document is concerned. But this KGB document actually goes like 1.5 million years ago is when kind of things start with this document, and they start talking about Lemuria before all of this, and like the Venus race, and so it gets kind of weird. We'll cover that stuff in a different video, but this document does not treat the Sumerian stories as the beginning like the Sumerian stories are generally read. Like when we go and we read these things, like the Enuma Elish, I know I've said that 6,000 times, but when we read that document, the document or that story, it does not start with something like, oh, hey, we're going to talk about this creation, but there was tons of other stuff that happened before. It doesn't start like that. The way the Sumerian texts go, that's the beginning. I mean, that's where things start. For whatever reason, this KGB document is under the belief that things actually started like 1.5 million, 2 million years ago with like Lemurians and Atlantis and Venus people, and it gets crazy. We'll cover that in a completely different video. But I do find it interesting that this document puts the Sumerian story in the middle. I don't know why they do that. Like, I don't know why. I mean, maybe I guess they base it off the king stuff, but it's just another oddity with this document. So the only reason why I bring that up is, well, one, just to say, hey, it's really crazy what this document goes into. But two, when you read this thing, don't be so quick to believe everything that they are talking about as if this thing has the answers. I love documents like this because there's probably a lot of truth in here. I would not be surprised if stuff in here actually happened and is legitimate. That said, there's probably a lot of disinfo in here as well. And I have a feeling that the chronology that this document presents to us, in the sense of, you know, going back 1.5 to 2 million years ago, is designed very specifically to throw us off the scent to reality. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, everybody knows at this point in time that the vast majority of the world's governments are at the very least influenced by people who are not necessarily government people. If you know what I'm saying, right? There are other influences out there that can sway governments to go in very particular directions, right? And I would not be surprised at all if Russia during this period of time, or we know for a fact, it's not we know for a fact that back during the time that this document would have been created, we know there are bad actors influencing Russia, the same bad actors that are influencing and were influencing America back then as well. Right? People, that's a different topic, but anyway, but those bad actors may actually have put some sway into the government to make the KGB present and create a document like this that has some truth to it, but that also provides information that would throw people off from the truth. And I believe that the chronology that is presented here is doing just that. So if we're talking about 2 million years ago, 500,000 years ago and stuff like that, and we're talking about, you know, Sumerian stuff happening back then, that's not realistic. And nowadays especially, we know for a fact that we don't need that kind of a time scale. And in fact, even further, none of the scientific evidence supports a time scale like this. Right? All the new evidence that we have nowadays, all the new science, even the old science really, all the science, like the real science, I guess is what I should say. The real science really does support that a lot of crazy stuff happened on planet Earth, and I don't just mean catastrophes. I'm talking about the general human story may not really be that old. And once again, this has nothing to do with any kind of religious creationist garbage. It's nothing to do with that. But all of the evidence really does point in a direction to where a lot of the stuff that has happened on this planet has happened only in the past either few thousand years or maybe upwards of 12 to 15,000 years or so. Like, I realize that's kind of one of the dates that we hear nowadays, you know, 12 to 15,000 years ago. You know, the pyramids kind of fall under that date nowadays. It's kind of trendy to do that kind of stuff. But it gets really interesting because that might even be too far out as well. Now, I'm still wrestling with that, but I'm getting better at it because the reality is, you know, the evidence doesn't necessarily point to even that far back. Now, okay, so anyway, with all that said, I'm going to shut up now because I've gone on long enough and this is all schizo garbage anyway. But just keep in mind that when we start to see any kind of a source trying to convince you that things are hundreds of thousands or millions of years old, make sure that you, as an honest researcher, as somebody who is practicing critical thinking and truly employs the scientific method, you know, make sure you're doing that when you see stuff like this. Don't just blindly believe it just because it is coming from a source with some sort of authority. Now, once again, this document, we're just looking at it because it's interesting that we find anything like this in a government document at all, at least in my opinion. I mean, why waste your time? You know, unless they're trying to do some sort of disinfo or mix up information. And that's probably what's really happening here. But that does not mean that we might not be able to find something interesting while we read this. Right? So we'll pick up other threads as we go along. Maybe, anyway, okay, so I'm done talking. I'm out of here. I got bum fights to go bet on. Yeah, boy!